Hi, writers. Welcome back to this week's revision lesson. This week, we're going to focus on movement in our stories and on forward action. One of the biggest struggles writers have is getting and keeping their protagonists and their narratives in motion. If a story feels stagnant, whatever the reason, readers will have a difficult time staying interested. Often, finding ways to dramatize the themes and quieter questions we set out to explore can seem daunting. How do I get readers to go along with my character's desire to find inner peace, for example? How do I get readers to follow my protagonist's search for identity without it all taking place in her head? In this week's readings, we follow our respective protagonists as they hit the road, staying in relative constant motion. In the Alexei story, we know exactly what our protagonist, Jackson, is after. The macro dramatic question: will Jackson be able to redeem his grandmother's powwow regalia? The answer: yes. The dramatic question is clearly laid out for readers, and we know exactly what yes or no answer we are reading towards. You might edit the dramatic question to say, will Jackson be able to find the $999 to redeem his grandmother's powwow regalia? Again, we know the answer will be either yes or no. In this case, no. But the reversal, the pawnbroker giving it to Jackson anyway, means Jackson gets the physical object of his desire in the end. Typically, if a character is trying to convince the story's antagonist, that is the main character standing in the protagonist's way of getting what they want, of something, giving Jackson the regalia for $5, for example, then we need some physical action to change the antagonist's mind in order for the achievement to feel earned. If the writer is skillful, a compelling argument presented by the protagonist in dialogue might be enough, though often it is not. The problem with allowing dialogue to carry forward the action is that, well, what can be said in a climactic scene through dialogue that couldn't have been said the first time the protagonist and the antagonist squared off? What's actually changed? Again, it's doable, but I would argue that Jackson's getting the regalia feels earned, not because he says anything differently the second time he and the pawnbroker meet, and not simply because the pawnbroker had time to allow guilt to change his mind, but because we spent significant time with Jackson on a rather unlikely journey. We don't necessarily know all of the stops Jackson will make at the beginning of his journey, but we know where he'll need to be at lunchtime the next day, so we have a clear time and destination in mind as we read. By first giving us Jackson's final destination and a series of timestamps, we're firmly grounded, and Alexei can fill in the backstory about Jackson's grandmother without worrying too much that we'll lose interest. Of course, there is a limit to how long we'll stay engaged in the backstory before the want to return to the forestory will begin to nag at us. So you'll want to keep flashbacks and expository info dumps minimal. Some of Jackson's backstory, though, does the work of increasing the stakes, which increases our desire to see our unlikely hero get what he wants. This is the kind of backstory you want to use, and you'll want to consider providing it at the point in the story that your reader has a very clear understanding of where the foregrounded narrative is taking them. This story begins with Jackson claiming not to want to tell us why he became homeless, but he later links the theft of the regalia to his grandmother's death, which then led to his homelessness. However unlikely it may seem that getting the regalia back will turn his life around, the stakes are still increased as we understand that a great wrongdoing will feel to be corrected if Jackson gets what he wants. The goal is not arbitrary then, even if it's random coincidence that allows him to spot the regalia and set the story in motion in the first place. Take special note, by the way, of who our narrator assumes or suggests the recipient of this tale is. What's important here on a craft level is that our intended narratee, who is not necessarily the same as the reader, is from outside of Jackson's culture. This dictates what information Jackson provides. If the narratee were another homeless interior Salish, much of the explanations and scene setting would appear awkwardly provided for the sake of world building, which writers want to appear effortless and natural. But as we're told that the story is being recounted to outsiders, Jackson rightfully must walk us through what it means to spend a day in his shoes. You'll likely have noticed a version of this tactic used over and again across storytelling modes when a narrator or protagonist finds themselves on a journey to or having newly arrived in an unfamiliar world. Think Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, or any of the Jode characters in The Grapes of Wrath, Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, Janie in Their Eyes Were Watching God, or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and so on. Writers create outsider protagonists to be the vessels through which readers experience the world they've created. And you'll definitely want to note when you're writing that there's nothing worse than having two characters discussing what they both already know to be true for the purpose of funneling information to readers. However, two characters giving a third, new to town character info can work really well. Alternatively, if our protagonist is staying put in their own hometown, you'll often have an antagonist coming into town, such as in Needful Things, Jaws, The Master and Margarita, Madame Bovary, or Charles Baxter's Griffin, and countless other narratives. And note that rather than either of these modes, in Alexi's story, it is not the protagonist or the antagonist who are new to town, but it's the assumed listener of this tale. Now, for those of us writing characters who fall outside of the dominant culture and the dominant narratives that have been told, a challenge we may face is one of cultural translation. For example, does your native Spanish-speaking protagonist italicize Spanish words and explain what they mean? If she is explicitly or implicitly speaking to other members of her community, for example. The answer may be a simple or resounding no, but what happens when it's time to send the story to editors who don't speak Spanish or don't understand the cultural references that help build your narrative and don't feel particularly compelled to stretch themselves? Alexi's established narratee offers one way to make the problem for the writer the problem for the character to address. Now, I'm not saying we should begin creating narratees of the dominant culture for all of our stories, as that's extremely limiting and problematic, but on a craft level, it's worth understanding how this plays out in this particular story, especially if this is a challenge that you face as the writer. Now, in the Jones story, we get the sense of a longer distance being traveled, as Cassandra and friends need to get across town and back. Anytime you send your characters on a journey of this sort, you're creating this question in the reader's head. Will they get there? Jones sets up all kinds of physical obstacles for his characters, which again become questions that hold readers' interest. Will the car break down? Will they get lost? Will the volatile nature of their relationship finally sour things permanently? Readers will want to know these answers, and there will be a sense that the story is moving forward, even as it continues to explore the deeper questions. Will Cassandra stop getting in her own way? What happens when she finds out that the friend she has pinned her hopes on has died, as we already know straight away from the title? Remember, forward action must happen outside of our characters' heads and must not happen in flashback or backstory. If it happens in flashback, even if it's an action-packed car chase, fight scene, or life-altering event, it is not forward action. Forward action moves our stories and our protagonists towards the story's climax and resolution. While flashback and backstory can play a number of important roles, including adding stakes and clarifying details, they serve only to catch us up to the point at which we are meeting our characters in the present narrative. So, if you don't have any forward action in your story, and the story somehow resolves itself, you may not yet have a completed story. One thing you can do is make a list of all the forward action happening in your story, and that is every physical movement, every movement from room to room, say, or from part of town to part of town, any action that's taking place outside of your character's head, that's happening in the present action, that is not in backstory and not in flashback, and see how much actual physical movement your characters have. This is a helpful exercise to see if anything appears to be happening, even if there's a great emotional journey. We need that physical action, that forward action, in order to feel as though something has changed or that a change has been earned.